Hey, what's up, guys? Today I wanted to talk about something that's really been interesting me lately, and that is comparing single player and multiplayer games. I actually got this idea for the video while I was talking to one of my friends because he prefers multiplayer games, and currently I'm actually not sure which one I prefer more. If you asked me this question a few years ago, I would easily say multiplayer because I was playing games like Call of Duty and Halo. But for the last year or two, I've really been enjoying some really good single-player games. Now, the experience between the two is very different for most games. Obviously, for games like Halo, there could be an exception because, you could play the single player with a friend. But I think of a single-player experience to be more intense because you're by yourself and you could really get involved in the story, or at least I like to get involved in the story. And I think of multiplayer to be more casual and addicting, but not as mind-blowing as a campaign can be. Now, I want to break down both single-player and multiplayer games with the pros and cons. I'm going to start with the single-player because I've been enjoying so many good single-player games lately, and I just find it more interesting to talk about. We could start by talking about how engaging a campaign could be, especially with a few of the games I've been playing lately, like Duke Nukem Forever, Call of Duty 1, Far Cry 4, Mafia 2. I know it's a very random mix of games, and, there's a few others in there, but those are the single-player games I just happen to be playing right now. Now, you want to know what all these single-player games have in common? All these games put you in a character's shoes, and while you're playing as these characters, you start to connect with them. For example, when I played Far Cry 4 as AJ, the main character, he felt like a relatable person who could have been real, but he's in this crazy world of Kyrat. At first, AJ is nervous and scared about everything happening to him because it's pretty insane, and his reactions just seem realistic. Then later on in the game, he starts to be more confident and starts to enjoy killing the Royal Army. And throughout the campaign, you'll experience and live through AJ going through these changes. And I find these experiences very fun and unique. Even for some games, they can be a little dry, like Duke Nukem Forever. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed playing in Duke Nukem's shoes, shooting those alien bastards. But it wasn't quite like the AJ experience. I'm not gonna lie, it was a funny experience though, with the stupid jokes Duke would say and the trash humor, but I actually enjoyed the corny jokes and childlike humor just because, I could find it funny, and Duke Nukem Forever felt more engaging than the better original classic Duke Nukem 3D, just because it felt like you get to connect with the character more, even though I find the original better. I just enjoy being in different characters' shoes and experiencing new fictional personalities because there is no boundaries in video games. Also, like in a game like Mafia 2, you get to play as an Italian gangster, Vito Scaletta, in the 1940s, who was just in a war but made it back to America and has to hustle in these gang-related jobs just to make it for him and his family. I just love games like this where you get to experience these crazy scenarios that something like a movie would have, but you actually get to play it yourself and experience it yourself. Like, tell me you wouldn't want to experience being a Russian soldier in war, forced to fight against enemies with higher ground than your enemy, weaponless. This forces you to safely follow your friendly soldiers' orders without getting gunned down and looking for a gun with very few bullets. That is the magic of a classic game like Call of Duty 1 can give you. Now, you don't need these compelling stories to have a great single-player game. And a lot of old school shooters focus on just the pure gameplay. Games like Duke Nukem 3D, where the whole story is literally Duke Nukem saving his babes from aliens. Yeah, sounds real original, right? Or another classic series like Wolfenstein, where your objective is to kill Nazi bastards as a guy named BJ Blazkowicz who hates Nazis. Sounds simple enough to me. And finally, my favorite of these classic shooters that focus on pure gameplay is, this might not be a surprise, but the original Doom, where there is a bit more story than those two games, but that's not exactly what you're supposed to focus on, even though you can. You're supposed to focus on killing all the demons in hell in fast-paced action gameplay. And I really like using Doom as an example of a game that focuses on pure gameplay way more than the story, because I think Doom is more of a single player experience than most of the story games out there. It has the best balance of difficulty, at least for me. I consider myself to be a pretty good gamer, and a lot of single player games on a medium or that middle difficulty can be too easy for me, or I'll die maybe a few times in a whole campaign. And I guess you can argue, why don't you just crank up the difficulty? And my really weak counter argument would be that the first time I play a campaign or a single player, I like to explore the map and experience everything in said campaign. And in most games, if you turn up the difficulty by 1, it's usually way harder than turning up the difficulty by 1 should be, and then you get your ass kicked a lot, and then you get frustrated because enemies will just melt you way too fast. But in a game like Doom where you have 5 difficulties, every time you crank up the difficulty by 1, it gets noticeably harder but not frustrating, just more challenging like it should be. Because there will be more enemies dealing more damage, and since there's more enemies, you'll have to focus on your ammo count more. And I also just love the creepy yet genius level design in Doom. Mix that with the feeling of being alone and having a demon around any corner, and I think you have one of the best single-player games revolving just around gameplay. Also, Doom has one of the only single players where I want to go back after I played and beat it, and I just think it's amazing, you know, it just does everything right. If you haven't played Doom, go play it. I might make a whole other video on Doom, but now I'm gonna stop praising Doom and talk about some cons of single player. And just to state the obvious, a con for single player games is that you have to play by yourself. Sometimes I wish I can experience some single player games with a friend, even though I know in some cases it really wouldn't work. But don't you wish you could play games like the Mafia series or Tomb Raider with a friend? But that's why we have games like Halo and Borderlands where you can play a campaign with a friend, and I really appreciate games like that make it work. Also, on the topic of playing alone, in some cases, you can really feel alone having no friendly AI, and sometimes that'll make me not want to play the game for a little bit just because the feeling of loneliness in that game. And I noticed this in some games like in Wolfenstein and Shadow Warrior, but it really does make me appreciate all the friendly AI in Call of Duty and Far Cry. And other than the single player ending and having less replayability, I don't think there's much other cons for single player games for me. You guys let me know what you think of single player games and where you stand on them. And now we're going to start with the pros of multiplayer. I'm going to start this off the same way I did with the single player. The very obvious reason why multiplayer can be better is you can play it with friends. And obviously playing with friends can add a ton of replayability and sometimes just simply be more fun. But the thing about multiplayer games for me is it's pretty difficult to play them by myself. And this is a little problem I've somewhat recently got, maybe in the past year or so. There's only a few multiplayer games I could play by myself, but even then, I'd rather just play a single player game. Sometimes I'll play a multiplayer game just to experience it by myself for the first time, but for the most part, I play multiplayer with friends for the funny and raging times, you know, whatever may happen. And some of my favorite times in video games is getting addicted to a good multiplayer with a friend and just living that grind and, you know, leveling up and just getting the best loot. And I know I talked a lot more about single player than multiplayer, but that's because I've been enjoying a lot of single player games lately, and I really wanted to talk about it. Something I forgot to mention about single-player games is sometimes it could be hard for me to actually start up the game because I could get lazy or just not want to, knowing I'm by myself. And when I'm playing multiplayer with friends, it's easier to get encouraged to get on the game because it's another person. Anyway, I'd really like to hear some opinions from you guys about the topic of single-player versus multiplayer games. I think most people would go for the multiplayer route over single-player. Just because most people play multiplayer games and you could play them way longer. But yeah, guys, just leave a comment of what you like more, and I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. And I know it does seem a little biased of me to talk way more about the single player, but if you guys want, I could talk more about multiplayer games and get more in depth with it. But anyway, that would be another time. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did. Subscribe to me if you're new. I'm ThatOnlyBeast13, and I'm out.